Second warning.
Greetings and welcome to Amazing Little Known Stories in Black History and Exploration, brought to you by the Explorers Club's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. My name is J.R. Harris. I'm a resident of New York City, and I've been exploring unsupported and mostly alone in remote areas around the world for more than 50 years. Some of these journeys are included in my book, Way Out There, Adventures of a Wilderness Trekker. I'm on the Explorers Club's board of directors, and I chair the club's DEI committee. When not in the wilderness, I am founder and president of JRH Marketing Services. Established in 1975, it is the oldest and most experienced African-American owned consulting and research firm in the United States. I was selected to the Market Research Hall of Fame in 2016, and I've been a member of the Explorers Club since 1993, and I am thrilled to be your host for tonight's program. Although this is the final day of Black History Month, I can assure you that while this may be the last, it is certainly not the least of the month-long celebrations around Black history and culture. We have a great program for you tonight and a splendid group of presenters. Before I introduce them, I'd like to say just a few words about the Explorers Club's DEI initiative. The key premise to the DEI initiative is that a more diverse membership will be beneficial to the club. Recent studies have demonstrated that diverse groups function more effectively because of the different experiences and perspectives that diversity provides. Furthermore, a diverse membership will ensure that the club remains relevant in and representative of today's increasingly multicultural world. DEI can enhance the club's image during these times of change, and more importantly, it can augment our mission to promote exploration by enlisting ethnically, socially, economically, and racially diverse, as well as disabled members to help us further this important undertaking. If you have any comments or suggestions about the club's DEI efforts, I invite you to email me at jrharris@explorers.org. Now let's turn to tonight's program. Our four talented scientists and explorers will address Black history and exploration from their unique perspectives. At the conclusion of these presentations, we'll have a little panel discussion followed by a Q&A. So please feel free to post any questions you may have for these panelists. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Lou Tillman. He has been an Explorers Club Fellow since 2004. He has carried the Explorers Club flag on 10 expeditions or led or participated in many other efforts in the areas of history, archaeology, and anthropology. He has traveled to 147 of the 196 countries on Earth and worked in 30 developing countries, including 17 in Africa, for the World Bank and for USAID. He has written on explorer Matthew Henson, Reverend Josiah Henson, and Matilda McCree, the last living survivor of the infamous slave ship Clotilda. Dr. Tillman is currently leading an effort to document the history and descendants of the Clotilda and Africatown in Alabama, in cooperation with the Clotilda Descendants Association. He's also an expert in Melanesia, the Republic of Vanuatu, and the black birding slavery system of the Southwest Pacific, having worked for 3 years in the Vanuatu Prime Minister's office. Dr. Tillman will discuss the various Explorers Club flag expeditions that have focused on Black history, exploration, and survival. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Lou Tillman.
Thank you, JR. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Great, okay. And let's show my slides here. All right, can you see that slideshow all right?
Can do.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, JR. I appreciate it. Thanks for the great introduction and for the great honor of being able to speak and help organize this important panel. As mentioned, tonight I'll be talking about the Explorers Club flag expeditions that are focused on Black history. And I'll be talking about these 6 topics, but one I'll leave to one of my colleagues. So I'll be mainly focusing on these on 5 of these 6 expeditions. Well, you may ask, why me? You know, as some of you may have noticed, I'm not Black. So what the heck am I doing on this panel, right? Well, I guess I've always been interested in helping out folks who are sort of on the getting the short end of the stick. I think that probably dates back to when I was being raised in Haiti. I was actually 8 years old, and I remember looking around at the oppression and the poverty there and thinking these people need help, and maybe I should try to spend part of my life at least trying to make their situation better. So that led to working with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers in Florida, serving as a volunteer on the slave ship replica Amistad, and working, as mentioned, for the World Bank and USAID in 30 developing countries, including quite a bit in Africa. I got involved in Black history, particularly at the Montgomery County Parks, where I volunteer in the Archaeology Department, working on archaeological artifacts related to Josiah Henson, the amazing Black man that you will hear about very shortly from me. But enough about me. Let's talk about the cool stuff, expeditions. As many of you know, carrying the flag of the Explorers Club is a great honor, and it's not granted lightly. A comprehensive application must be submitted and is carefully reviewed by the club's Flag and Honors Committee. In researching this topic, the first club expedition that I found was that focused on Black history was undertaken in Guinea, West Africa, carrying flag 147. And as shown here, Dr. Warner Montgomery, a fellow of the club, carried flag 147 in 2006 and studied the archaeology and history of a slave trading corporation. Astoundingly, this corporation was owned and operated in Guinea by South Carolinians for over 70 years. Captain Stiles Lightbourne of South Carolina established a self-proclaimed slave factory there, married a woman who became the queen of the area, Queen Niara Belli, and their son became chief of the area in the next generation. I've never before come across this kind of shocking vertical economic integration of slaving, where Americans actually obtained slaves in Africa, processed them, shipped them to America, and sold them, all to maximize their own profits. Pretty astounding. On the slide, you see some the flag of South Carolina and the Explorers Club flag on that expedition. And you can see that Niara Belli is still famous in the area. That's the hotel is named after her in that area. Turning to another expedition, I was honored to be able to participate and lead the Henson expedition carrying flag number 50 in Montgomery County, Maryland in 2020. I started this effort because I wanted to answer the question of what's the relation, if any, between the great Black explorer Matthew Alexander Henson, shown in the bottom of the slide, and the astounding Reverend Josiah Henson on the top of the slide. That question gets raised all the time in Montgomery County, and apparently nobody was able to answer it, so I looked into it. Well, who was Josiah Henson? He's not quite as famous, perhaps, as Matthew. Josiah Henson was born enslaved in Maryland in around 1797. He was sent to Kentucky, and conditions there were even more terrible, and he determined to escape. In 1830, he walked an amazing 600 miles all the way to Canada, cross-country, carrying 2 of his children on his back, with the rest of his family walking alongside. A notional image of this is shown in the upper right of this slide. Josiah carried his 2 toddlers, weighing together probably over 50 pounds, and his supplies in cloth sacks on his back, not a fancy backpack like we would have today. The family averaged about 15 miles per day, walking for 41 days, often at night, evading slave catchers. They used the route as shown in the map on the right-hand side of this slide. This is one of the most astounding family escapes from slavery in U.S. history. It's quite an amazing fellow. Josiah later served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, rescuing 118 people, including his brother. He exhibited his lumber products that he made in Canada at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, and was received by Queen Victoria and met her 3 times, as shown in the sketch in the bottom. But his most important contribution by far was inspiring Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was a phenomenal novel that sold millions of copies. It was probably the best-selling book in that period, other than the Bible. And that novel was credited by President Lincoln as helping to start the Civil War, which, of course, ended slavery. So that's quite an achievement. A major product of this flag expedition was the first ever report on the genealogy and history of the Henson clan, which I wrote 135 pages long. And I was able to develop quite a few family trees, as shown in the lower left of this slide, and helped to support the new museum, the Josiah Henson Museum, which is shown on the right of the slide, here in Maryland. And I hope you will visit that if you come here to Montgomery County, Maryland. I was also able to find a possible grandnephew relationship between Josiah and Matthew, thus partly answering my original question, as shown in the hand-drawn family genealogy chart shown on the left side of the slide. And I was able to prove a relationship between Matthew Henson and modern Hollywood film star Taraji Henson, shown in the center of the slide, and trace many other family trees. Of course, we can't leave the Hensons without mentioning the greatest Henson expedition of all, the co-discovery of the North Pole. Here we see Matthew Alexander Henson in the center. If you look at the image in the lower right, he's at the pole, holding the U.S. flag. The Explorers Club flag, unfortunately, was not carried on this expedition because that was not a tradition at that point in 1909. That started about 10 years later. But 4 other flags were carried, as shown here in the image, including, unusually, the DKE fraternity flag of Captain Robert Perry's college fraternity. On the left of the slide, you see the 4 flags listed and the names of the Inuits who were part of the expedition, who carried flags and were a key part of the expedition. By the way, most scholars agree that the first person to the pole was actually Matthew Alexander Henson. He was scouting ahead of the team and inadvertently arrived at the pole 45 minutes ahead of Captain Robert Perry and the 4 Inuits. We in the Explorers Club are very, very proud to have Matthew Alexander Henson as our first Black member, and certainly one of our greatest. So turning to another expedition at Montpelier in Central Virginia. This expedition took place in October 2021 at President James Madison's Montpelier plantation. Our focus was on using traditional dirt archaeology and working under the supervision of the excellent Montpelier Archaeology Department. We were trying to figure out what the mysterious burn site was. This site consisted of 3 depressions and a layer of burnt clay. And you see the traditional dirt archaeology going on with the pits that we were digging. I was part of a much larger team, as shown in the bottom of the slide. And the team was able to figure out that this was likely an 1840s or so barn for curing tobacco, using slow-burning, smoky fires worked by enslaved African Americans. A similar structure, but probably smaller, is shown on the center right of this slide. The barn was also possibly temporarily occupied by African American enslaved families and youth while awaiting sale. As the soil was depleted in Virginia, Montpelier under President Ndali Madison, sadly and rather shockingly, became a breeder plantation for young slaves being sold down the river to Louisiana. As part of this effort, I was able to help document an amazing African-American family tree, as shown on the right of this slide, consisting of 11 generations from Africa all the way down to the present. Very unusual. Let's start at the top where you see the black arrow. The family starts, as we know of, with Captain Hemmings, a white man who had a liaison with Partina, an enslaved woman brought from Africa. They were the grandparents of the famous Sally Hemings, who's shown in the generation with the blue arrow, but they were also the grandparents of Sally's half-sister, Brown Hemings, who worked and was enslaved at Montpelier. In the next generation, you see the most amazing person in the family tree, John Freeman. That's the red arrow generation. He was enslaved and worked for President Jefferson at the White House and at Monticello for 8 years. In 1809, he was sold to President Madison and was enslaved at Montpelier and at the White House. During the burning of the White House by the British, Freeman was recorded by an eyewitness as the only person who saved a piece of valuable White House furniture, a feather bed. He also, importantly, saved his wife and child. He was the grandfather, if you go 2 generations down to the green arrow, of 2 black soldiers who served in the Union Army in the Civil War. And both were wounded in combat against the Confederates. If you look at the left of the slide, you see a picture of one of these brave men, Lieutenant John Freeman Shorter of the U.S. colored troops. My main contribution was taking that family and then tracing it all the way down 5 more generations to the present, where I found a fantastic modern group of people, mostly educators holding degrees from Howard University and other somewhat lesser known outfits. You may have heard of them, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford. Turning to another expedition at Montpelier that happened a month and a half later. My colleague Jasmine Burr will speak about that in just a minute. So I'll pass on to current efforts having to do with the Clotilda and Africatown, Alabama. As was mentioned in the introduction, the Clotilda is now quite famous and is being covered by National Geographic and other venues. At Sundance, they're premiering a film about it. And as many of you know, the Clotilda was the last slave ship to enter U.S. waters, illegally sailing into Mobile Bay in Alabama in 1860, with a cargo of about 110 Africans from Benin, or what is now Benin. The ship was burned and scuttled to conceal this capital offense of smuggling. And the letter in the lower right of this slide is written in the handwriting of the captain, boasting about this act, how he managed to pull off this illegal act. The Clotilda wreck was recently found by a multi-organizational team led by a fellow of the Explorers Club, James Delgado of Search Incorporated, and also by one of the key people, Ben Raines, a former reporter in the area. Ben is shown in the lower part of this slide holding a fragment of the ship. After the Civil War, Africatown, Alabama was founded by 32 Clotilda survivors, becoming the only town in America founded by enslaved Africans. These survivors kept their African customs and languages for all their lives, and even tried to return to Africa. Their small settlement grew and peaked at about 12,000 inhabitants right after World War II. Unfortunately, over the last 40 years, Africatown has lost much of its employment base and has declined to about 2,000 to 2,500 people, with much poverty and a very high cancer rate. If you look at the land use map in the upper right of this slide, you'll see Africatown in the center of the slide as yellow and blue and green, but it's surrounded on 3 sides by purple. Well, unfortunately, that purple represents heavy industry, chemical plants, and waste dumps, the cause of a lot of this illness. The focus on the Clotilda and the worldwide publicity and the flow of funds that's coming in as a result is bringing hopes of revitalization to this important community. And a new Africatown museum is right now, as we speak, under construction. As seen in the lower right is the artist's conception of the museum, which is under construction. Well, I was asked by the Clotilda Descendants Association to trace their lineages, and I started with Matilda McCree. She was the last living survivor of the voyage, having died just really quite recently in 1940. She had survived kidnapping in Africa at the age of 2, her father killed in front of her during the assault on the village. She was obviously on the voyage, the Clotilda voyage, was enslaved for 5 years in Alabama, escaped, was recaptured after being chased down by dogs. She was subjected, of course, to statutory rape and likely forcible rape. She was forced to have her first child when she was only 14, and she had 14 children while working all her life as a field hand in central Alabama. Amazingly, several of her grandchildren are still alive today. One is pictured in the middle of the family tree that I was able to put together for her descendants, as shown in the center of this slide. So don't let somebody tell you that slavery is way, way back in our history. There are people alive today whose grandparents were enslaved. So the current effort is working to document Africatown and the descendants of 2 of its co-founders, Polly and Rose Allen of the Clotilda. We will be undertaking field interviews and research in Africatown, and I'm here in Alabama right now. Africatown's just a few miles northwest of me, and we'll be hopefully contributing content to the new museum. We've recently been granted flag number 212 to carry on this effort, and it's shown here over my shoulder. It's hanging behind me. So in conclusion, I think that our club, of course, it's very focused now on diversity and inclusion, and that's a wonderful goal. Black Americans have great stories to tell about exploration, determination, and their accomplishments. But I was only able to find about 5 flag expeditions, 5 or 6 now, 6 expeditions carrying the flag that focus on this important topic. And we've launched over 1,400 expeditions in total. So I think we need to focus on this important topic in our expeditions as well as in our recruitment and other aspects of the club. And if we do that, then I will thank you, and all these great people that you met tonight will thank you. So if you want more information, or if you want to contact me, there's my email. I write a monthly column. I've got Facebook and so on. You can read some of my stuff. And I'll turn the mic back now over to JR to bring on our next speaker. And thank you very much.
Well, Lou, that was great. You thanked us, and now I'm going to thank you for a very nice presentation indeed. Thank you so much. It's also now my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, and her name is Jasmine Burr. She is actually a student member of the Explorers Club, and she's completing her undergraduate degree in archaeology and anthropology at Queens College, City University of New York, my alma mater, by the way. She participated in her first Explorers Club flag expedition, an archaeological metal detecting survey in search of traces of enslaved workers, after applying to a notice put up in the club's expedition's electronic bulletin board. She is currently researching the history of Africatown, Alabama, and the genealogy of 2 of its co-founders, survivors of the infamous 1860 slave ship Clotilda, as Matt just mentioned. Jasmine is planning a career in archaeology focused on the history of the enslaved in America. She will present on the recent flag 212 expedition in search of traces of President James Madison's enslaved workers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jasmine Burr. And Jasmine, there it is.
Thank you, JR. I will discuss the November 2021 flag expedition that I participated in at President James Madison's Montpelier Plantation. We were in search of traces of the numerous enslaved workers who toiled for the Madisons during the family's 120-year ownership of the property. The topics that I will be covering today are some background on Montpelier, the unique methodology used, the expedition participants, our archaeological findings, who paid for the Constitution, and last but not least, future archaeological work that is planned. As shown in the map here in the upper left of this slide, the plantation is in Orange County in Central Virginia, which is about 45 miles northwest of Richmond. The plantation now has about 2,600 acres. The main mansion shown in the lower left here has been restored inside and out to President Madison's period about 1820. Now, the Montpelier Foundation manages the site for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the foundation has a very active, innovative, and world-class archaeology department. That department has decided over the last 15 years that the history and archaeology of President James Madison and Dolly Madison has been very extensively explored. And so the department is now focused on telling the unknown story of the enslaved Black workers and families who did the work and who constituted the vast majority of the people on the estates. This new emphasis involves looking for clues to the living and working conditions of the enslaved. Archaeology is really the only way to study this, since almost all the plantation records were intentionally burned in the 1850s. A major new permanent exhibit on slavery in the US and at Montpelier has been developed and installed by the Archaeology Department and the staff historian. Slave quarters have been reconstructed, as you can see in the upper right of the slide. A main focus for archaeology has been also the home farm, shown in the lower right, where architectural, processing, and industrial scale blacksmithing were the two economic engines of the plantation. All efforts have involved the Montpelier Descendants Committee and other local African-American residents, as shown on the bottom of this slide. In the past, archaeologists and metal detectors did not get along at all. Detectors felt that archaeologists were trying to stop their hobby, whereas archaeologists felt that detectors were looting items while recording the vital information about the context of each find. But for the last decade, the Montpelier Archaeology Department has trained the two groups to work together for mutual benefit. Now the department has a routinized methodology in which the metal detectors are used as the cavalry of the operation. They do surveys of the ground using 20 and 3-meter grids, working much faster than traditional dirt archaeology. With this new approach, hotspots can be rapidly identified and marked for later excavation. Using this new method, over 100 historical sites have been identified at Montpelier, probably 10 times the number of sites that would have been identified using only the traditional approach. Using this new methodology, 1/3 of the entire plantation has already been surveyed. All hits in each grid are recorded in real time in a digital database. You can drill down and see exactly what each hit was with a description and a photo. And you can search for and map particular items, for example, all nails found from a specific period. This is shown in the map here in the upper right. We worked in 2-person teams, you can see here in the lower right. One person used the metal detector to look for iron or other metal objects. The other person dug small holes to examine a sample of the hits in each grid. We then photograph each item and record the results in real time in an ESRA, Geographical Information System, also known as GIS. Here you can see the 4 members of the Explorers Club who participated in the expedition. We were part of a team of 19 volunteers, interns, and staff of the Archaeology Department. Notice that President and Dolly Madison were enthusiastic members of the flag expedition, although they didn't say much. Here you can see our club team members doing the key tasks as metal detecting, flagging, digging divots or shovel test pits, and examining finds. Over the years, many amazing finds have emerged which tell the story of the Madisons and the enslaved on the plantation. Here on the left, you can see wine bottles from the president and his father. And in the center, a blacksmith forge that was very important to the economy of the plantation. In the upper right is a key for a slave shackle, and in the lower right is a fingerprint in a brick made by a child. Unfortunately, young enslaved children were commonly given the task of making bricks. I found the historic nails here shown on the left of this slide. Such nails were typical of our effort. Luckily, these can be dated to within about 100 to 200 years, depending on the method of manufacture. Probably the best ever find at Montpelier is shown here in the upper center of the slide. This is a small carnelian ring found in the enslaved quarters. Now, research has shown that this was made in India, likely traded to East Africa, then across to West Africa, then carried on a slave ship to America, probably by an enslaved woman. She probably lost it when it fell through the cracks of her cabin floor. Thus, this beautiful ring ended its 11,000-mile astonishing journey, but this was found almost 200 years later in the ground of Montpelier. Now, there's no doubt that James Madison was the genius who was the father of the US Constitution. He was given 9 months' notice that was the first Constitutional Convention would be held in 1787 in Philadelphia. He used that time to study over 1,450 books on governmental structures. He studied the Greeks, the Romans, the British, Swiss, French, Dutch, Belgium, and Germanic, and other confederations and alliances. And from his effort emerged our unique three-branch constitution. But who gave him all that vital study time? Well, his family have been served by about 100 slaves every year over 120 years of Madison ownership. Multiplied by a modern living wage of $15 per hour, that comes out to about $500 million in revenue for the Madisons. Now, all of that time translates into over 17,000 person years of work. That is what paid for his plantation and the Constitution of the United States. Interestingly, many of the Montpelier descendants are proud that their ancestors contribute to so much to the creation of our republic. But a little credit might be nice. And of course, Montpelier is just one plantation. Think about the thousands of other plantations across the country. This is billions or even trillions of today's dollars of free labor. As a millennium, this is something I was never taught. I think it is important to understand the significance of what enslaved people contribute to the United States. Their work was a major foundation of the US economy. Future archaeological work and expedition over the next several years at Montpelier will focus out on the Vital Home Farm area. It is this area that was the economic engine of the Madison's wealth. And it is only recently that this has become clear by shifting the research focus to tell the complete story of the Madisons, the plantation, and the slave workers who toiled there. Future efforts will continue to explore the area we metal detected, since it is not yet clear if we found a major structure, a fence line from a Federalist period, or a combination. And work will continue in metal detecting across the entire property and in traditional archaeology, lab work, conservation, analysis of finds, reconstruction, and public outreach. And I want to say thank you, everyone, for having an interest in Black history. And thank you to the Explorers Club for helping me to dig up my first ever historic finds in this field, which you see I'm holding up in this photo.
Wow, that was great, Jasmine. Thank you so much. And it's really great to have input from one of our student members, you know, and we wish you all the best in your future, your exploration future and your educational future. And thanks again for those great presentation and all the information that you gave us. Fantastic. Which leads me now to our next presenter. I'm happy to introduce Rebecca Davis. Rebecca holds a BA in history and 2 master's degrees, one in historical archaeology from Newcastle University in England, and one in archaeology anthropology from the University of Bristol. She is currently working on her PhD in archaeology at the University of California at Santa Cruz. She has expertise in landscape and plantation archaeology and history in the United States, England, Haiti, and the Virgin Islands. Ms. Davis will discuss an archaeological and historical study of LARITAGE plantation in Maryland, one of the largest post-revolutionary slave plantations in the state, cruelly run by white French immigrants from Haiti during a period when the slave population of Maryland was as high as 29%. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to present Rebecca Davis.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that amazing introduction, JR. You're gonna have to forgive me. I'm not great at presentations yet, and I'm so incredibly nervous. So bear with me.
No worries.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see here. There we go. There we go.
There you go.
Fabulous. All right. So my presentation's on Frederick, Maryland's LARITAGE plantation. Generally, it's just an assessment of the Caribbean style plantation that we find in Maryland, of all places, right? So let's see here. For the purpose of this, oh, excuse me. So sorry. There. All right. So for the purpose of this presentation, it becomes necessary to define what is meant by the terms space and place. And so following Heath's 2010 definition, space is used in reporting physical dimensions or characteristics of architecture and landscape, while place, quote unquote place, refers to the constructed meaning of space through individual experiences, memories, and the specificity of the landscape. So if the plantation space was the warp, the scale, size, design used to enforce a rigid system of economy, power, and control, then place would be the weft of human experiences and actions, the unique weavings that developed survivance strategies and meaning making, the threads of daily life that were sometimes determined by the framework kind of instituted, but often complex and creatively woven. So my research seeks to understand both the warp and weft of a plantation's built environment, but primarily it's to understand the enslaved lives, to complicate the established histories of the captives taken from Africa to the Americas. So I want to know the experiences of, starting from the upper right to the left, which is a representation of the Bois Cayman celebration just prior to the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution, and then the lower right picture, which is a depiction of LARITAGE. Originally, I was studying the plantation landscapes in Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, but due to the global pandemic that we find ourselves in and social and political unrest in Haiti, it became necessary to kind of pivot. I soon found a connection between Saint-Domingue and Maryland, and that was through the 18th century family, the Vancendier family, who fled the Haitian Revolution 2 years after the revolution began and settled in Maryland. While the bulk of this presentation will be about deciphering the enslaved narrative on this plantation, the discussion does need to begin with the French Creoles who bought this plantation to provide, a necessary background of the framework that was implemented. So the original plantation consisted of 748 acres and was settled in 1794 and was owned by the Vancendiers until its sale by Victoire, the matriarch of the family. And she actually was she ran the entire operation, which is a really interesting divergence from the norm. The sale happened in 1827. The red outlined section labeled Best Farm is the site of the former plantation. And again, prior to settlement in Maryland, the Vincendiers had a very successful kind of system in the Western province of Saint-Domingue in a parish called Jérémie. And to give you insight, just a little insight into the production of trade goods from Saint-Domingue, during the 18th century, the colony was supplying 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the world's sugar, in addition to its secondary exports of cotton and indigo. So, I mean, that's a pretty big kind of production, actually, for such a small, very small colony, French colony. So given the nature of this operation, the plantation systems located there were very sizable and very intense, especially the kind of the import of enslaved bodies versus the export of surplus goods. So when the family flees from Saint-Domingue after the revolution started, they're not only 15 enslaved individuals with them, but they're also their understanding of the landscape, how it's used, how they manage that landscape, and lastly, kind of expectations and accepted behaviors of their enslaved workforce. So, and again, to give you a sense of the framework and what it can look like, I've listed three main considerations, commonly found intermittently throughout the Chesapeake and Mid-Atlantic. So the first is the ecological concerns, landscape layouts, and then economic efficiency. And please understand that this list is by no means comprehensive. If it were, this presentation would be several hours long, and I've only got 15 minutes. So, so a general overview would be that, the plantation landscape is grounded in a medieval framework, believe it or not. It strived to be a self-sufficient entity. It only represents the biggest landowners in the colony, and of course has a heavy reliance on the enslaved workforce that was generally, but not always, but generally kept in peripheral locations. So access to architectural information, building methods, securing the capital to initiate these ventures, especially given the fact that there weren't guarantees of immediate returns, monetary returns, and not to mention the investment of enslaved bodies, were all a hallmark of a very select group of privileged individuals from a very select group or area of the globe. So one of the best ways I think anyway, to understand kind of the colonial Euro-American perspectives and experiences during the 18th century and their worldviews is through the lens of plantation landscapes and spatial layouts. So if we look at ecology, again, in the highlighted section, we see, goodness of soil, easiness of access, convenience of distance from shipping place, and a stream of water running through the premise. And although the estate may prove very productive without a union of all these advantages, it would be foolhardy not to have at least one or two of these. As for the layout, symmetrical building techniques was definitely one of the hallmarks of the Georgian order, being able to split a building or a landscape down the middle and seeing a mirror image on both left and right sides. Temple-like houses, you definitely for the main houses. Geometrical spatial patterns, again, similar to Georgian order. These features are present within the landscape, usually found in gardens or orchards, building placements within the landscape, and of course, surveillance was key to all of this. So then we have economic efficiency of the plantation, the nucleated center, what Jasmine referred to as the home farm in her presentation. That would be the nucleated center for Montpelier, which consisted of, close proximity between areas of production, natural resources, surplus crops being grown, and the workforce. All right, and to give you a visual of this, I wanted to, this map right here is a 1775 plat from a former coffee plantation that was located in Jérémie, in the mountains of Jérémie, where the Vincendiers had lived. And similar to what was mentioned previously about the ecological concerns, we see in the middle panel, we see what appears to be a green, thriving landscape, abundant water resources or sources, as well as well-defined primary and secondary roads. Then, there's also the well-defined spaces for cultivation of crops, as we can see on the right. And to the left, we see separate living quarters for the main family, domestic servants, enslaved servants, which is characterized by number 9 up here. And then again, even though you can't really see it, it's also number 6 down there. The enslaved field servants, as well as various functional decorative gardens. And notice too that you can draw a line from the area marked as 5 all the way through the main house, through the wooded grove at the back of the main house. And again, this is just to give you a visual of the type of ordered world that the Vincendier family was coming from, and most likely maintained while they were plantation owners in Saint-Domingue. So they brought with them this toolkit, these elements of Caribbean plantation life to Maryland. And again, just to give you a little context, I wanted to kind of throw in some modern day pictures. On the upper left, we have Dr. Shayla Monroe, a colleague of mine who just successfully defended at UC Santa Barbara. She's digging in the enslaved quarters, but in the background, you see the overseers, the main house, and then the stone barn. And then again, the 3 other pictures are a little close up of everything that's going on there. And even with the main house, even though the picture is a little skewed, you can still cut the building down the middle and you'll have a mirror on both sides. And what's really funny about this is that the way it was constructed, it doesn't appear it here, but the windows are actually very tall. It had very high ceilings and it was on top of a hill, which is not really that practical in, a place that has different seasons, especially in the winter. So there was a complaint of it always being cold in the house. All right, so, and again, we see methods of surveillance going on here as well. And I believe that the Vincendiers purposely placed the enslaved quarters between the overseer's house, the main house, and the road and waterway as another form of surveillance. So let's think about the weft of plantation life, right? To understand the weft of plantation life, we need to think about connections between landscape and people. And I think this quote is just amazing, so I'm going to read it. Landscape is more than a visual arrangement. It becomes a backdrop for human action. The relationship between people and landscape is an element in the articulation of everyday actions. It's the connection that allows the researcher to see landscape as a text, as a source of study that enhances the dialogue of people in their lives. So in order to enhance that dialogue, and given that relationship, how do we start to weave the unique enslaved narrative at LARITAGE? And we do that by understanding that the word slave erases a lot. And to understand that is by considering the occupations the enslaved individuals held at this site. So when we think about differentiation in assigned professions, we think about, the domestic enslaved. Think about what that entails: the knowledge of how to dress, meal preparations, housekeeping methods, even hairdressing. I mean, they were still using those like white wigs, the ability to mend and sew. Personal attendants often were privileged in intimate knowledge to those that they served. So that wasn't a position that was held lightly. We think about skilled workers, men and women with medicinal knowledge, midwifery. In Saint-Domingue, Women would often run the hospitals that were located on plantations. If we think about blacksmiths, in some cases, which I have been lately because I'm working at Montpelier at the moment, blacksmiths in some cases could move on and off the plantation property. They could be political organizers, community leaders, insane mathematical skills, and have to have an expertise in how to work with the metal. Then we have coopers, who have the knowledge of woodworking. We have day laborers who are often jack of all trades, again, kind of going on and off the property, being hired out. We've got animal husbandry, knowledge for the care and keeping of animals, both of the enslavers and of the enslaved's own animals. So yes, this landscape was meant to reinforce domination and economic gains, but it also represents enslaved specialized skills and technical knowledge, fundamental aspects of their daily lives and what they look like away from their quarters. So if we throw like alternate, vocabulary in there, I think we can even apply doctors, engineers, veterinarians, in addition to, skilled agricultural laborers and factory workers. Let's see here. So, and then we also turn towards the documentary record because this family and the plant and its enslaved individuals show up in the documentary record really kind of uniquely. So we have, here we have a runaway advert that tells us a lot about the enslaved individual fleeing the plantation. So we've got in the highlighted area, the Negro slave, Pierre Louis, he's about age 35, weak temperament, height 5 feet 8 inches, had a white hat on. He stole a large number of clothes that he carries in a packet. He has a small ring in one ear, and in another kind of advert similar to this one, it's described as a gold earring. He is a père couleur. I have no idea how to say that, and I apologize to any French speakers out there, but it's a hairdresser. He plays violin, he speaks French and English poorly, and he carries a gold watch and a violin. So Pierre Louis is actually one of the enslaved individuals brought over Saint-Domingue. So again, we've got a gentleman that's bilingual. He obviously was one of the more kind of expensive, horrible word, but valuable enslaved individuals living there. And then we've got more documentary records in personal accounts and court records where we have that describe this plantation. We've got a Polish traveler who sees instruments of torture, stocks, wooden horses located near the main road, as a place of punishment, but also a place to embarrass and kind of signal domination over enslaved bodies. But then we've got court records where, the state of Maryland is pursuing legal actions against Victoire and this gentleman named Payen, who is part of the family, for their ill treatment of their enslaved. Again, 1797, Payen was indicted on 7 counts of unmerciful beating and whipping. They brought actions brought against them for not supplying their enslaved community with food and clothing. And then in 1797, Pierre Louis sued for his freedom and ultimately won it in 1799. Just remarkable. So, and I'm way over my time, so I'm just going to kind of skip through this a little bit. But again, this isn't LARITAGE, but again, this will show you how the space is being used. So the little circles, we've got subfloor pits, we've got the actual structures, and the cooking pit that's at a central place, to all of the enslaved cabins. So what do we see at LARITAGE? We have at 2 previous excavations, they noted spatial layouts that had more symbolic nature. Again, we're thinking about domination. We're thinking about Georgian order, that kind of thing. The enslaved quarter was constructed at the same topographic elevation as the overseer's residence. It was a barrack style, which is what you typically see in the Caribbean rather than in the mid-Atlantic. Let's see, the enslaved village was deliberately placed between the front of the house and the main road for punishment purposes. But then you have a fence line structure that kind of highlights the unique area that belongs to that one barrack. So as an archaeologist, we're all about the material remains, right? So when we see high volumes of faunal, for our faunal analysis, when we see high volumes of shell, cow, pig, bird, and fish, we understand how they're eating. But also in relationship to the documentary records, we know that the enslaved were not getting provided or getting provisions from the Vincendiaires. So how are they, we start to question, how are they getting this food? You know, fish could be a passive kind of hunter-gatherer way of getting food. Bird, you know, relatively close by or easy to catch. I'm not 100% about the pig and cow. Some of the interesting finds would be the peck stone used for grinding nuts or other foodstuffs, fire-cracked rocks, which would be typically found around a hearth, coins and metal pendants, again, kind of indicating how people are dressing. And then we've got, on the right-hand side, we've got how they're using their ceramics, right? Their pearlware, creamware, you know, typically to hold soups, tureens, that kind of thing. The utilitarian ware would be used for storage. Tobacco pipes would be for, you know, relaxing or, you know, some sort of networking opportunity. And because I work at Montpelier now, I have a very high appreciation for slag and rose head nails and how they're made. So some sort of metalwork, forge, blacksmith is taking place within the enslaved community. And then molded, free blown, and flat glass. So the molded and free blown kind of tells us about what they're drinking, what they have access to. And then the flat glass could be from, you know, a window pane from their barracks, which is kind of unheard of. So these are some of the ways that we build out the enslaved narrative. Hopefully we're trying to complicate these narratives to make them more than two-dimensional representations that we typically see in history. And with that, I'm going to skip to the end because I'm way over time and just say thank you. And I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, feel free to email, that kind of thing. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Rebecca.
Sorry.
That was great. You know, it's fascinating perspective that, you know, plantation landscaping is something we don't usually hear about when we talk about Black history. So thank you very much for giving that unique perspective. And with that, I'd like to introduce our final panelist, and that is Dr. Betty Kearse, a retired pediatrician. Over the past 30 years, she's developed close ties to US President James Madison's Montpelier plantation in Virginia and its staff, as she did research for her multiple award-winning book, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family. According to the oral history of her family, she is a descendant of the enslaved Cook Corrine and her enslaver and half-brother, President James Madison. In recounting the struggles, perseverance, and contributions of 8 generations of her family, this intimate memoir illustrates that enslaved Africans possessed hope and inner strength by which they survived, and talents by which they contributed mightily to America. Kirk's Reviews describes the other Madisons as, quote, a roots for a new generation, rich in storytelling, steeped in history, unquote. In a descriptive personal narrative, Betty will describe how she walked literally in the footsteps of one enslaved ancestor and was called to the unmarked grave of another. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Betty Kearse.
Thank you so much, JR. And I want everybody to sort of focus on my slides and not on me. So if you can make me small and make the slides big, that'll be better. So as JR indicated, my talk is less scientific and more personal. So please join me on 2 visits to Montpelier.
Looks good.
Okay, now starting with 2 important words, that's griots and griots. So griots, women, and griots, men, keep the stories of their ancestors alive. For thousands of years, generations of West African griots and griots have served as human links between past and present by telling the stories of their ancestors and the history of their people. And when Africans were stolen and enslaved, they did not leave their tradition of oral history behind. Without it, I would not know that I am a descendant of the enslaved cook Corinne and her enslaver and half-brother, President James Madison. According to the history told by the 8 generations of my family's American griots and griots, James Madison Jr. became attracted to his half-sister Corinne, who was by then a cook known for her apple pies. And around 1794, that attraction led to the birth of a son, my great-great-great-grandfather, Jim. Shortly after the end of the War of 1812, Dolly Madison, having learned that Jim and one of her nieces were in love, sold Jim. As he was being taken away, Corinne pleaded with Jim, always remember, you're a Madison. She believed the name could help them find each other someday, but they never saw each other again. Yet Jim remembered his mother's words and passed them on to his children and told them to tell them, their children, that they are Madisons. Over the generations, as America changed, words were added, and Corinne's plea became my family's credo. Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. So the credo reminds us that we aren't just descendants of a president. We are descendants of enslaved people too. In 1990, when my mother, my family's 7th generation griot, turned over to me the old cardboard box of family memorabilia, I became the 8th generation griot. When I asked her, why now? She answered, I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. I was stunned. This is my family's tree, and the griots and griots are shaded. Now you've just heard about Corinne, the enslaved cook who had the relationship with James Madison Jr. and who started the credo. But the story started with Corinne's mother, a stolen woman called Mandy. Mandy told Corinne, who told Jim, who told my great-great-grandfather Emmanuel, who told my great-grandfather Mac, who told my beloved Gramps, who told my mother, who told me, who told Nicole, who tells my grandchildren, Peter and Madison, that she, Mandy, was stolen from the shore near her village in Ghana, carried across the ocean in the bowels of a wretched ship, shoved onto an auction block, sold, forced to work on a small cotton field in a remote corner of a big tobacco farm, and then raped by her enslaver, James Madison Sr., the future president's father. Corinne was born through those encounters, thus making her and the future president half siblings. In 1992, to try to make sense of all this and to try to find evidence of some of my enslaved ancestors, I began my journey of discovery of my ancestors, our country, and myself. I traveled to Lagos, Portugal, where the transatlantic slave trade began, to Ghana, West Africa, where Mandy was born, to Baltimore, Maryland, where a replica of a slave ship, like the one that carried Mandy away from home, sits in a museum, to Travis and Bastrop counties in Texas, where my great-great-grandparents and their 8 sons learned that they were free. And to New York City, where an 18th century African burial ground had recently been discovered. But my journeys began and ended at Montpelier, James Madison's former plantation in Virginia, where Mandy labored and died. On my first visit, I met Lynn Lewis, who was then the chief archaeology. After I told her my family story, she took me to the rear of the mansion and pointed out a path of bare soil about 3 inches deep and a foot or so wide that ran between the rear entry of the mansion and an excavation site about 70 feet away. When we reached the site, Lynn knelt down and folded back a tarp. This was the kitchen, she said, and that path was worn into the ground by generations of enslaved cooks walking to and from the mansion, serving the Madisons and their multitude of guests. But what I saw was more than a hole in the ground and a rectangle of bricks. And the path was something extraordinary. My great-great-great-grandmother Corinne had walked this path. I stepped into the furrow and followed the length of it. My eyes teared. I had not expected to walk so literally in the footsteps of an ancestor. I had found Corinne. And seeing where the kitchen had stood and recalling the stories I knew so well, I felt the tears flow. This might have been where James Madison Jr. first noticed Corinne, and where not far away, she had stood helpless while Dolly sent Jim away. The visit was taking its toll on me, but I said to Lynn, I really should see where my enslaved ancestors are buried. Not a good idea, she cautioned. The grave sites don't have any names or dates on them, And besides, I would not recommend you go there in those shorts and sandals. There's lots of poison ivy. Overwhelmed and tired by being in the same place where 3 of my ancestors had been held in bondage, 2 of them raped and 1 sold, I was relieved not to go. Next time, I promised. Next time. But it took me 5 years to return. I was afraid I would see an isolated patch of dry dirt riddled with poison ivy, a place where enslaved individuals in death, as in life, had been dishonored. Lynn was leading me toward a low hill that rose behind a cluster of trees when she stopped and said, "This is it." The field of bright blue periwinkles took me by surprise. We stepped off a dirt road and entered a small woods. "It's because of these periwinkles," Lynn said, "that we know this is a burial ground. Back then, folks in the South planted them to pretty up cemeteries. And under the leaves, we found linear depressions, all oriented east to west, where the graves had sunk a little. And then last winter, there was an early thaw, and the only snow left was in the depressions. It was eerie and very beautiful." Lynn guided me further in, careful we did not kick the headstones and footstones, crude chunks of white quartz. We stood in a kingdom of many trees, but only one of them called to me. Nestled at the base was a stone the color of raw flesh. I knelt down and touched the rock, envisioning my family's matriarch, our first griot, lying beneath. My shadow fell over the rock, uniting me with my 5 greats grandmother. I looked up from the stone and said to Lynn with absolute confidence, "I have found Mandy." Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Betty. That was really a stirring story and a great way to wrap up these 4 fantastic presentations. I see we're running quite a bit over time. And so for those of you in the audience, if you put in some questions, we may not be able to get to all of them today, but we'll see what we can do for the next few minutes. Before we take a question though, I have a question for some of the panelists here. And it's this: as Black History Month comes to a close, how can we continue to amplify the voices of Black American history and exploration? Anybody have any thoughts on that one? Don't be shy. You know, well, I'll suggest something. You know, it's because we're in the final day of Black History Month here in February, I think it's incumbent upon us to remember that we celebrate 28 days here for Black History Month, but Black history is really 365 days a year. Black folks are Black every day. Stories are still out there that are untold. And, I applaud these scientists and explorers like we have on the panels today for bringing a lot of stories to light and enlightening us on our history. And by our history, I mean American history as well. So yeah, thank you for doing all that. Now, I see we have a couple of questions in the chat room here. And so I'm going to go straight to Susan Copelas has a question for Rebecca. I would love to hear more details about the hoops you had to go through to get these records and get access to the plantation to dig.
That is a really great question, Susan. It's actually, believe it or not, wasn't as hard as you would have expected it. This was a dissertation project that I wanted to do. It's actually since changed. I'm actually, because I work at Montpelier, that's where my dissertation is going to be now. But yeah, so I emailed, got in touch with the national parks. I emailed the person who actually did the digging, and she shared her the report that she did. So yeah, it wasn't that hard. And you know what? Believe it or not, there's a lot of information out there, just a simple Google search away.
Thank you. I see from a note here, we have folks watching from Ontario, from Barcelona, New England, Austin, Texas, Northern California, Quebec, DC, Alberta, Costa Rica, and many more. So welcome to all of you international and domestic folks that came to hear us tonight. That's great. We have a question for Jasmine from Jim Westerman. Can you tell us more on how you got on the Flag 212 team?
Oh, yes. It was very interesting. Like it was mentioned, I am an undergraduate student and I was looking to gain more experience before graduate school. So as a student member, I have access, and I was looking at the forms and I saw Lou's ad asking for volunteers for the excavation at Montpelier. And I responded, and it just went from there, and everything just worked out.
So yeah, do you want to go ahead, Lou?
Yeah, I might add just a little something.
Sure.
So that's one of the great benefits of being a member of the club. There was and will shortly be a sort of a bulletin board where you can advertise for needed skills or members for upcoming expeditions or ideas you have on expeditions. So I just posted an ad like that. And also, it's a great place to network. Some of the most amazing people in the world are members of the club, from astronauts to divers to folks who've been to all the tops of the 7 peaks in the world, and just about any kind of exploration or science you want to do, you can find somebody in the club who will help you do it. Thanks.
Right. So we have Dawn Copeland says, we love qualitative research. Do you have any suggestions on techniques on how to collect it? Also, do you have any stories from oral or spoken traditions that have been passed to any of you? All right, so qualitative research is essentially research, unlike a survey where you ask specific questions and just tick off the answers. In qualitative research, it's more of a free-flowing type of interview where the respondent can speak in their own words. And so this person, Dawn Copeland, wants to know, do you have any stories from oral or spoken traditions that have been passed to any of you?
Actually, yes, we do. And and it's all Dr. Kearse. Oh my goodness, especially in relation to her ancestor, Corinne. Oh, would you tell us about the bead/ring that was found?
Well, I do have lots of oral tradition in my family, and I'm really blessed with that. And oral history is just so important, especially among African-American families, because very often that's all we have. Well, the story about the bead/ring is that Mandy, whom I mentioned, has being our first African ancestor in America, the tradition says that she came over with beads in her hair, red beads. And it is thought, or at least I think, that it is possible that her bead was actually a ring, and that perhaps she gave the ring to Corinne, and Corinne dropped it near the kitchen, the south kitchen, which is being excavated now, and which is, where I walked in Corinne's footsteps. So, that's one wonderful story. And we're working on getting that ring put in a place where it can be shared by the general public. Right now, it's kind of tucked away. Another story in my family is everyone knows about the portrait of George Washington being taken down and saved during the Battle of the War of 1812. Well, in my family, there's a story that Jim, who was actually the president's son, saved the flag, that he folded it up very neatly and put it under his jacket and hid with it in the woods. I won't go on and on, but we have lots, and most families have these wonderful stories that need to be shared.
Is it possible, Betty, that the general public can visit this dig or visit this Montpelier?
Oh, absolutely. There's going to be a dig that's open to the public. And if you go to montpelier.org/dig, I really don't type very well. You can sort of scroll down and get information about it. It's going to be in April from I think it's April 27th to May 1st. And it's just going to be fantastic. There's going to be a dig, an archaeological dig. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once and I don't type well. So I typed it into, okay, that's one way to find it. So we're going to dig in one of the areas where artifacts that enslaved people once handled can be found. And then there's going to be a cooking program in which participants will learn how to do open hearth cooking and learn some of the foods and cooking traditions once employed by enslaved people. And then we're going to make chairs. We're going to do carpentry using the same types of tools and nails and so forth that enslaved people would have used. So yes, there is one way. And then if you have questions, you can go dig@montpelier.org. I don't know why I am trying to type here.
No worries, Betty. We have it in the chat
we got you
on
covered.
Facebook. So
okay. And this is where you can email and get more information. So the registration would be on that website, the montpelier.org/dig. But if you have questions, then you can go to dig@montpelier.org. But I'm going to be there, and I want to meet explorers, and it's open to the public, and it's just going to be a wonderful event. Oh, and I forgot to mention something about this event. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his last name, but the man who runs the Slave Dwelling Project is going to be there, and his project is sleeping overnight in existing slave quarters throughout the country, and so that's going to be part of it. All right. Okay, his last name, but it's just going to be a wonderful event.
Fantastic. So looks like we're coming to a close here. I want to, well, first I want to give a quick shout out. I see that we have some grads from Howard University that are checking in. So good on you out there in DC or wherever you are. Also, before we sign off, I want everybody to be aware that next week on our program, we have the ethics of exploration from Dudley and Stevens to Joost Koosbush. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. Club member and lawyer David Hoffman and President Emeritus Ted Janulis, streaming live at 7:00 p.m. next Monday, March the 7th. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for tuning in. Thanks to our 4 presenters for a fantastic program tonight. We wish everybody well and have a good one. Thank you.